New York City in early September carried that strange in-between air where summer refused to leave, but autumn had already slipped its fingers through the cracks. The morning sky over Manhattan stretched pale grey, not quite cloudy, not quite clear, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Down in Brownsville, Brooklyn, the streets smelled of wet concrete and fried plantains from the corner bodega. But 20 minutes north by subway, the glass towers of Hudson Yards and Manhattan West rose like a different country entirely, cold and gleaming, catching the first weak light of the day. Aisha Malone stepped through the revolving doors of One Manhattan West at exactly 7:43 in the morning. She was 24 years old, 5'6", with dark brown skin that caught the light like polished wood. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, low bun, not a strand out of place, the way her mother had taught her. Her cheekbones sat high and sharp, framing a pair of deep-set eyes that held something unusual for a girl her age. Not hardness exactly, but a kind of stillness, the look of someone who had learned very early that flinching was a luxury she could not afford. She wore a black blazer bought from a Goodwill thrift store on Fulton Street for $11, taken in by hand at the waist and sleeves, so it fit like it was made for her. Underneath was a white cotton blouse she had ironed twice that morning. Her only pair of heels, black and scuffed, had a left heel worn down nearly a quarter-inch shorter than the right. She had cut a piece of rubber from an old sandal sole and glued it underneath to balance herself out. Nobody would notice, that was the point. Inside her bag sat a container of rice and black beans she had cooked at midnight and a small bottle of insulin for her mother, just in case. The lobby of One Manhattan West soared upward in glass and steel, the ceiling disappearing into a height that made voices echo and footsteps sound important. Aisha crossed the marble floor toward the elevator bank for Voss Capital on the 47th floor. She pressed the button and waited. When the doors slid open, 6 other interns were already inside. They looked like they had been assembled from the same catalogue. Tailored blazers in navy and charcoal, leather bags with brass clasps, shoes that had never touched a subway grate. They were talking about the Hamptons, about someone's father's yacht, about a restaurant in Tribeca that required reservations 3 months in advance. Aisha stepped in and stood near the back. A girl named Rachel Palmer stood closest to the door. She was 23, blonde hair cut to her collarbone, a Cartier bracelet thin as a wire circling her left wrist. Rachel's eyes drifted down to Aisha's shoes, paused there for 1 second too long, then slid sideways to the girl beside her. She leaned in and whispered something. The other girl pressed her lips together to keep from laughing. Aisha heard it clearly. The acoustics in an elevator are unforgiving. I guess the diversity program lowered its standards this year. Aisha's hand tightened around the strap of her bag. Her jaw set, but her face stayed perfectly still. She looked straight ahead into the mirrored wall of the elevator and saw her own reflection staring back, steady and unbroken. She told herself the same thing she had told herself on every first day of everything, from the first day of middle school to the first day at Columbia. You are here because of your brain, not because of their pity. The 47th floor opened into a world of glass partitions, white desks and screens glowing with numbers that moved like living things. The Voss Capital internship program took 12 candidates each year from the top universities in the country. It was considered one of the most competitive entry points in American finance. Aisha was the only one who had worked 3 jobs through college, the only one whose application essay described growing up in a zip code that banks used as a synonym for risk. That first week, every intern was assigned to a team and given one challenge. analyzed the risk profile of Project Prometheus, a proposed $500 million acquisition of a technology company. 5 days, 1 presentation, the teams that performed best would be fast-tracked. Aisha was placed in the group supervised directly by Victoria Langford. Victoria was 29 years old, Vice President of Client Relations, and the daughter of Robert Langford, a man who sat on the Voss Capital Board of Directors. She was tall, slender as a blade, with honey-blonde hair, always swept into a perfect chignon. Her suits were Stella McCartney. Her voice carried the particular confidence of someone who had never once in her life been told no. She smiled often, but the smile never quite reached her eyes, which stayed watchful and calculating like a cat deciding whether to play with its prey or simply crush it. In the first team meeting, Aisha sat at the far end of the conference table with a printed stack of financial statements she had highlighted in 3 colors the night before. While the other interns nodded along to the senior analyst's model, Aisha noticed something. 3 subsidiary companies registered in the Cayman Islands were missing from the debt calculation entirely. She ran the numbers twice on her phone calculator under the table. The gap was roughly $80 million. She raised her hand. This model is missing debt data from 3 offshore subsidiaries in the Cayman Islands. If we're wrong about this, we're buying a ticking time bomb. The room went quiet. Victoria, who had been leaning against the window ledge with her arms crossed, straightened up slowly. Her eyes locked onto Aisha with the precision of a scalpel. You are a first-week intern. This model was built by senior analysts with a decade of experience. Do you really think you know better than they do? Aisha held her ground. She began explaining the discrepancy, pointing to specific line items. Victoria cut her off, her voice dropping to that particular low register that was more dangerous than shouting. This is exactly why I have no faith in the diversity recruitment program. If you cannot keep your mouth shut, I will personally recommend your removal from this program by the end of the week. The room stayed silent. Not one person looked at Aisha. Aisha stood, gathered her papers, and walked out. Her back was straight, her chin was level, but inside her jacket pocket her fist was clenched so tight her nails left crescents in her palm. She knew what losing this internship meant. The stipend gone, her mother's supplemental health insurance cancelled. Marcus forced to drop his after-school coding program because there would be no money left to pay for it. What Aisha did not know was that Kai Voss had been standing outside the glass-walled conference room for the past 10 minutes. Kai was 34 years old, 6'2", with a lean frame that wore his dark-tailored suits the way a knife wears its sheath. His hair was dark brown, cut close, pushed back from a forehead lined with the faintest creases of someone who spent more time thinking than sleeping. His jaw was sharp, his eyes a shade of pale grey that people often described as cold, though a more honest word might have been guarded. He moved through the building the way weather moves through a valley. People adjusted to him. He did not adjust to them. The employees called him the Winter King behind his back, and none of them said it with affection. He had heard everything. He had watched the only person in that room brave enough to say the Emperor had no clothes, and she was right. He checked the numbers himself within the hour. The hidden debt was real. That afternoon, Aisha sat at her temporary desk, slowly placing her few belongings into her bag, preparing for the worst. Her screen lit up with a new email. Aisha Malone, reassigned to personal assistant to the CEO, effective immediately. Duration, 6 months. Report directly to Kai Voss. She read it 3 times. She did not know whether this was a reward or a punishment. That same evening, Aisha returned to the small apartment in Brownsville, where the hallway always smelled faintly of bleach and cooking oil. Gloria Malone, her mother, was lying on the old sofa, her face swollen from corticosteroid medication. Gloria was 51 but looked older, her body worn down by years of lupus and dialysis. Still she pushed herself upright when she heard the door, her eyes brightening as Aisha described the glass tower that touched the clouds. At the kitchen table, Marcus, 14 years old, skinny and sharp-eyed with the same high cheekbones as his sister, sat hunched over a second-hand laptop coding in Python. But his phone kept buzzing. Messages from Jalen, the 19-year-old who ran the crew on Pitkin Avenue. Marcus flipped the screen face down the moment he caught Aisha watching. She saw the evasion in his eyes and felt a new weight settle onto shoulders, already carrying too much. Derek Washington came by later with Gloria's medication. He was 26, broad-shouldered, with gentle hands that moved carefully from years of nursing work at the community hospital. He had grown up 3 doors down from Aisha in Brownsville and had loved her quietly for longer than he would ever admit. He sat with Marcus, told him stories from the ER, kept the boy anchored to the kitchen table a little longer. At the door, he leaned close to Aisha and said softly, "Jalen is targeting Marcus. You need to talk to him before it's too late." Aisha nodded, but she knew she could not hold her job and hold her brother at the same time, not every hour of every day. Across the river, and 60 stories above the city, Kai Voss sat alone in his penthouse at Hudson Yards. 4,000 square feet of glass and steel, no photographs on the walls, no plants, no evidence that anyone actually lived there. Just the cold blue glow of Manhattan at night pressing against the windows. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and took out a single photograph, creased at the corner. A boy of 8 and a woman with kind eyes standing in front of a small bakery in Munich, Elise Voss, his mother. She died of cancer when he was 12. His father, Henrik, remarried within a year to a younger woman who cared only about the money. After that, Kai was raised by his grandmother Maggie, and he learned the only lesson that stuck. Trust no one. Depend on no one. 3 years ago, Serena Ashford, the only woman he had ever let past his walls, sold confidential deal information to a competitor. When he confronted her, she smiled and said, "Do you really think anyone loves you for who you are?" They loved the name Voss. So did I. That sentence closed the last door inside him. But tonight, alone in the silence, he kept thinking about the girl in the conference room, the worn-down heels, the rice and black beans, the eyes that never dropped, not once, even when the whole room turned against her. For the first time in 3 years, something stirred beneath the ice he believed had frozen solid forever. The first week nearly killed her. Not the work itself, but the silence that came with it. Kai Voss did not greet her on Monday morning. He did not look up when she walked in. He placed a single sheet of paper on the edge of his desk and said without raising his eyes, "Daily briefing on my desk by 5:45 a.m. Market reports sorted by sector. Coffee black, no sugar, 74 degrees Celsius. Not 73, not 75, 74. Schedule synced to the minute. If I am late to a meeting because of you, you will not be late again because you will no longer work here." Then he turned back to his screen as if she had already left the room. Aisha stood there for 3 seconds. She picked up the sheet, read it once, folded it into her notebook, and walked out without a word. She did not ask questions. She bought a digital thermometer from the pharmacy on 9th Avenue during her lunch break and calibrated it against the office coffee machine. She set her alarm for 4:15 a.m. and did not miss it once in 6 months. The previous assistants had lasted 3 weeks on average. One had cried in the elevator on day 2, Another had sent a resignation letter written entirely in capital letters. A third, a Harvard MBA graduate who believed the position was beneath him, walked out after Kai told him his formatting was unacceptable for the fourth time in one morning. The Human Resources Department kept a rotation file specifically for Kai's office. They called it, not officially, but everyone knew, the revolving door. Aisha did not revolve. She arrived before dawn, left after midnight, and never once complained where anyone could hear. When Kai pushed a 40-page report across his desk at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday and said flatly, "Wrong, all of it, redo it by 5 a.m." Aisha picked up the document, held it level in both hands, and replied in a voice that did not waver, "Show me exactly where it is wrong, and I will fix it. If you just want someone to absorb your frustration, you have the wrong person." The silence that followed was unlike any silence that room had ever held. Kai's pen stopped mid-stroke. His eyes lifted from the page and found hers. He was not accustomed to being challenged, not by employees, not by partners, not by board members, not even by his grandmother Maggie, who loved him fiercely but had long since learned to approach his moods the way one approaches a frozen lake, carefully and from the edges. But this girl stood in the middle of the ice and did not look down. He set the pen on the desk. He pulled the report back toward himself. And for the first time he opened it page by page and pointed to specific errors, explaining each one. They worked until 3 a.m, the office dark around them except for the blue-white glow of 2 desk lamps. When Aisha finally stood to get coffee, Kai said quietly, almost to himself, "You are the first one who did not run." Aisha did not turn around, but she heard him, and she carried those words home on the subway like a stone she could not put down. Over the following weeks, something shifted in the rhythm of the 47th floor. It was subtle at first. Kai began asking Aisha's opinion during internal reviews, not out of politeness, but because she consistently identified risks that senior analysts missed. When she presented her analysis of the Asian market expansion, her voice steady, her logic clean as architecture, Kai realized he was genuinely listening for the first time in years. He watched her speak and thought not about the numbers but about the fact that she never performed confidence. She simply had it, the way some people simply have good posture because they were raised carrying weight. He started keeping her in the room after meetings ended. Not to give her more tasks. Just to ask, "What did you think of that proposal?" or "Where do you see the weakness?" He did not notice that he had stopped asking these questions of anyone else, but Victoria Langford noticed. One late evening, Kai walked past the employee break room on the 46th floor on his way to the private elevator. Through the half-open door he saw Aisha sitting alone on the small couch, her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice had changed entirely. Gone was the sharp, analytical edge. In its place was something soft and careful, a daughter's voice. "Did you take your medication, Mama? Is Marcus home yet? Don't worry about me. Everything here is fine." She hung up, lowered her head, and pressed the phone against her forehead with both hands. Her shoulders trembled, just barely, for no more than 5 seconds. Then she inhaled deeply, wiped her face with the back of her hand, stood straight, and walked toward the door as though nothing had happened. Kai stepped back into the shadow of the corridor before she could see him. He stood there for a long time after she passed. Something ached in his chest, unfamiliar and unwelcome. It was not pain for himself. It was pain for someone else. He had not felt that in so long he almost did not recognize it. Victoria Langford kept meticulous records of everything that happened on the 47th floor, not in files, but in her memory, which was sharper than most people's filing cabinets. She catalogued every glance, every question, every time Kai said, "What does Aisha think?" in a meeting. She measured the growing frequency like a seismologist tracking tremors before a quake. On a Friday afternoon, she made a reservation at Le Bernardin, a French seafood restaurant on West 51st Street, where the tables were spaced far enough apart for private conversation, and the clientele understood the value of not listening. Robert Langford arrived at 12:30. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, square-jawed, with the measured calm of a man who had spent 40 years making decisions that moved money in quantities most people could not visualize. He sat across from his daughter, ordered the poached halibut without looking at the menu, and waited. Victoria leaned forward, her voice low enough that even the waiter passing behind her would catch nothing. "Daddy, the CEO, is getting close to an intern, a girl from Brownsville. No family, no connections, no background worth mentioning. If this gets out, the stock takes a hit, and the merger between our families that we have been building toward for 2 years will collapse." Robert set his water glass down with a soft click. He nodded slowly. "I will handle it. You just hold your position and watch." Within days, Victoria began her campaign. She assigned Aisha tasks designed to be impossible within the given deadlines, complex cross-departmental reports requiring data from teams that had not been informed to cooperate. When Aisha delivered them late or incomplete, Victoria forwarded the results to senior management with brief notes questioning her competence. She let information slip in calculated doses to colleagues in the break room and the elevator, always framed as concern rather than malice. "I heard her mother is very sick, poor thing. Apparently her younger brother has been seen with that crew on Pitkin Avenue. I just worry she is in over her head, you know." The whispers spread through the office the way smoke spreads through a building, invisible at first, then impossible to ignore. In Brownsville, the situation Marcus Malone was drifting into had hardened from temptation into entanglement. Jalen Carter, 19 years old, lean and watchful, with a thin scar running from his left earlobe to his jawline, had identified Marcus months ago. Jalen was not stupid. He did not recruit with threats. He recruited with gifts. The new iPhone appeared first. Then came the sneakers, the meals, the feeling of belonging to something larger than a cramped apartment with a sick mother and an absent sister. One evening, Jalen put his arm around Marcus's shoulder and said with the easy warmth of an older brother, "You are smart, little man. You know how to code. Help me with one small thing, and you will have more than your sister can give you in her whole life." Marcus knew it was a trap. He had read enough, watched enough, understood enough. But when he looked at his mother coughing blood into a towel on the torn sofa, when he watched his sister come home past midnight with dark circles carved under her eyes, something inside him said he had to do something, anything, even the wrong thing. Derek found him at 10 o'clock that night walking with Jalen's crew down Pitkin Avenue. Derek grabbed Marcus by the arm and pulled him aside, his voice low and urgent. Marcus wrenched free, his eyes hot and defiant. "You are not my father!" The words hit Derek like a slap. He stood on the sidewalk watching the boy disappear around the corner, his hands hanging at his sides, and for the first time in his careful, measured life, Derek Washington did not know what to do next. 700 miles away in her brownstone on East 73rd Street in the Upper East Side, Margaret Voss, whom everyone called Maggie, set her teacup down on its saucer with the precision of a woman who had been setting teacups down for 60 years and never once chipped the porcelain. She was 67 years old, small-framed but absolutely upright, with white hair cropped short and eyes the same pale grey as her grandson's, though hers carried a warmth that his had lost somewhere along the way. She had built the foundation of the Voss empire from nothing after arriving in America from Munich as a 19-year-old with $40 and a torn coat. She understood money, power, and people in that order, and she never confused the three. A phone call from an acquaintance on the board had just informed her that her grandson was reportedly involved with an intern. Maggie did not raise her voice. She did not frown. She turned to her housekeeper, a quiet woman named Helga, who had been with her for 30 years, and said simply, "Book me a flight to New York. I want to see this for myself." It happened on a Friday afternoon in late November, the kind of grey New York day when the clouds hung so low they seemed to press down on the tops of buildings like a hand flattening dough. The 47th floor was quieter than usual. Half the senior staff had left early for a long weekend. The hallways carried only the hum of ventilation and the distant tap of a few keyboards. Aisha was standing in the pantry, a narrow room with frosted glass walls tucked behind the main corridor, pouring herself a glass of water from the filtered pitcher. She had been running since 5 that morning and had not eaten since the rice and beans she packed at midnight. Her reflection in the glass door looked thinner than it had a month ago. The door opened and closed behind her. She heard the click of heels, deliberate and slow, and then the soft snap of the lock turning. She turned around. Victoria Langford stood 3 feet away, her arms folded, her silk blouse the colour of cream, her lips pressed into a smile that carried no warmth whatsoever. Since being assigned to Kai's office, Aisha had crossed paths with Victoria only in meetings and hallways. They had not spoken directly since the confrontation in the first week. But Aisha had felt Victoria's presence the way you feel weather changing before the rain actually falls, in the whispers that stopped when she entered a room, in the reports that arrived on senior desks with notes questioning her work, in the colleagues who suddenly forgot to include her in email threads. "I know what you are doing, Aisha." Victoria's voice was sweet and precise, each word placed like a pin. "You think a girl from the projects can climb into the CEO's bed and change her life? I have seen your kind before, many times." Aisha set her glass down on the counter slowly. "I am here because of my work. My relationship with Mr. Voss is professional. If you have a concern, take it to HR." Victoria stepped closer until Aisha could smell her perfume, something floral and expensive that filled the small room like a declaration of territory. "Do you know what I did this week? I had someone look into you. Your mother owes $47,000 in medical bills. Your brother is running with a gang in Brownsville. Your father walked out when you were 6 years old." She paused, letting each fact land like a stone dropped into still water. "Would you like me to send this file to the press, or would you prefer to resign quietly?" The floor beneath Aisha's feet seemed to tilt. For one terrible second, the walls of the pantry shrank and she was back in Brownsville, 11 years old, standing in the school office while a counselor read her family's circumstances aloud to a room full of strangers as if poverty were a diagnosis. She felt that same heat rise behind her eyes, that same tightening in her throat. But she did not step back. She had spent her entire life learning the difference between feeling afraid and acting afraid, and she had sworn a long time ago that no one would ever see the second one. She looked directly at Victoria. "You are using my family's pain as a weapon. That tells the world exactly who you are, not who I am." Victoria's hand moved fast. The slap landed open-palmed against Aisha's left cheek with a sound that cracked through the small room like a dry branch breaking. Aisha's head turned with the force of it, her cheek flushed red almost instantly, her eyes filled, but nothing fell. She did not raise her hand, she did not step away. She straightened, faced Victoria, and spoke in a voice that was hoarse but unbroken. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The pantry door swung open hard enough to hit the rubber stopper on the wall. Kai Voss stood in the doorway. He had been walking past when the motion behind the frosted glass caught his eye, a raised hand, a sharp movement, and he had seen the slapland through the translucent surface as clearly as if the wall were not there at all. His face was a mask Aisha had never seen before. His eyes, usually the color of cold steel, had gone nearly black. The muscle along his jaw tightened until the vein at his temple stood visible beneath the skin. He did not shout. When he spoke, his voice dropped to a register lower and quieter than any raised voice could reach, and it was far more frightening. "Victoria, leave this building, right now." Victoria's face drained of color. She took one step back, her composure cracking for the first time. "Kai, she is just, you have 10 minutes to collect your things. Security will escort you out. And tell your father that his seat on the board will be reviewed at next month's meeting." Victoria's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. No sound came. She turned and walked out of the pantry quickly, her heels striking the floor in an uneven rhythm that betrayed the steadiness she was trying to project. Several employees in the corridor watched her pass, their faces carefully blank. Aisha stood alone in the pantry. Her cheek burned, her hands were trembling at her sides, though she held them still by pressing her fingers against her thighs. Kai stepped into the room. His right hand lifted slightly as if by instinct, reaching toward her face, and then stopped in the air between them. He looked at his own hand as though he did not recognize it. He lowered it slowly, reached into the breast pocket of his vest, withdrew a folded handkerchief, and placed it on the counter in front of her, without touching her. "I am sorry, this should not have happened in my company." Aisha picked up the handkerchief but did not use it. She held it in her fist and looked at him with eyes that were wet but absolutely steady. "I do not need anyone's pity. I need to know whether I still have this job because of my ability or because of something else." The question hung in the air between them. Kai met her gaze and held it. Something shifted in his face, not softening exactly, but opening, the way a locked door looks different when you realize someone has just turned the key from the inside. The fracture that had started weeks ago in the silent corridor outside the break room now ran long and visible across the ice he had spent years building. "You are here because you are the best person I have ever worked with. There is no other reason." Aisha nodded once. She set the handkerchief back on the counter, turned, and walked out of the pantry with her back straight and her chin level. Kai remained standing in the small room, staring at the folded cloth on the counter. His palms were warm, almost burning, though he had touched nothing at all. The following Tuesday, Margaret Voss arrived at 1 Manhattan West without announcement. She came through the lobby at 9:15 in the morning wearing a dove-grey wool coat, her white hair cropped close, her posture as upright as a woman half her age. The receptionist recognized her immediately and called upstairs. Kai was in a meeting. Maggie waved off the escort and said she would wait in the VIP lounge on the 47th floor, a glass-walled room with leather chairs and a view of the Hudson River. She sat by the window and watched. Through the glass partition, she could see the open floor of Voss Capital's executive wing. She watched Aisha move between 3 meetings in 40 minutes, a tablet in one hand and a printed schedule in the other. She watched her correct a formatting error in a presentation deck while simultaneously confirming a dietary restriction with the kitchen manager for a client lunch. She watched her bend down to pick up a pen that had rolled off the cleaning woman's cart and hand it back with a smile, saying something that made the older woman laugh. It was perhaps the first time anyone on the 47th floor had spoken to that woman as if she were a person rather than part of the furniture. Maggie noticed this the way she noticed everything, quietly, completely, and without forgetting. At 10 o'clock she asked the receptionist to send Aisha in. The girl entered the lounge with a polite nod, clearly uncertain why the founder's grandmother had summoned her. Maggie gestured to the chair across from her and poured tea from the porcelain pot on the side table. They talked for 40 minutes. Maggie asked about Brownsville, about Columbia, about Aisha's mother. Aisha answered without embellishment and without self-pity. She did not perform hardship. She simply told the truth. I grew up in a place where if you want to survive, you have to stand straight. My mother taught me that by never once stopping her fight, no matter how long she has been sick. Maggie set her teacup down. She was quiet for a moment, her pale grey eyes fixed on Aisha's face with an expression that was neither sympathy nor judgment, but something closer to recognition. I came to America at 19 years old with $40 and a coat with a torn lining. People looked at me with the same eyes. I know exactly what that look feels like. When Aisha excused herself to return to work, Maggie sat alone for a while, watching the river through the window. Then she picked up her phone and called Kai. He answered on the second ring. She said only one sentence. "My boy, for the first time, Steve, I believe you have chosen the right person." That same week, in a private room on the second floor of the Metropolitan Club on East 60th Street, Robert Langford sat across a mahogany table from Jonas Webb. The room smelled of old leather and cigar smoke that had seeped into the walls over a century of private conversations. Robert's voice was calm but carried the weight of a man who did not make requests, only arrangements. Victoria has been removed. Kai is losing control because of that girl. I need your help, Jonas. If he continues down this path, the board will lose confidence. I need you to stand with me at next month's vote. Jonas Webb, 45 years old, lean-faced with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on his forehead, stared at the glass of bourbon he had not touched. He was loyal to Kai. He had been the CFO since the restructuring, had worked 80-hour weeks beside him to pull the company back from the edge. But Robert Langford held proof of a personal transaction Jonas had made 3 years ago, a private trade that skirted the edge of legality, the kind of thing that would not survive the light of an SEC inquiry. Jonas sat caught between loyalty and the fear of exposure, and neither side of him could find the words to answer. Deep in Brownsville, in the glow of a laptop screen at 2 a.m, Marcus Malone finished the job. His fingers had moved across the keyboard with the precision of someone who understood systems the way musicians understand scales. The task had been simple in technical terms: hack into the order management system of an electronics retailer and reroute a batch of shipments to an alternate address. He told himself it was small. He told himself it was once. When the confirmation screen appeared, Jalen, who had been watching over his shoulder the entire time, took out his phone and pressed stop on a video he had been recording since the moment Marcus started typing. He leaned close, his breath warm against the boy's ear, and said softly, "Now you belong to me, little man. You want out? This video goes online. Your sister's job, your mama's name, all of it." Marcus sat perfectly still. His hands remained on the keyboard, but they were no longer moving. He stared at the screen, at his own reflection in the dark glass where the code had been, and felt something close around him like a door locking from the outside. That night, he did not sleep. He lay on his narrow bed, holding the second-hand laptop against his chest, staring at the photograph taped to the wall above his pillow, his sister standing in her black graduation gown on the steps of Columbia University, her smile wide, her future bright, and everything he had just done pressing down on him like a weight he would never be able to lift. The week that broke everything open began on a Monday in the first week of December, when the temperature in New York dropped below freezing and the wind off the East River cut through Brownsville like a knife through wet paper. At 2:13 in the morning, Aisha's phone rang on the nightstand beside her narrow bed. The screen lit up with Derek's name. She answered before the second ring because calls at that hour only ever meant one thing. "It's your mama." Derek's voice was steady, but she could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. "Acute kidney failure." She collapsed in the bathroom around midnight. "I brought her to Brookdale, but they don't have the equipment she needs." "She has to be transferred to Mount Sinai right now, Aisha. The estimated cost is around $120,000. Medicaid will cover part of it, but nowhere near enough." Aisha sat up in the dark. She pressed her free hand flat against the wall beside her bed to stop it from shaking. She said, "I am on my way," hung up, pulled on her coat over her pajamas, and walked out into the freezing night without locking the door behind her. By Tuesday morning, she had not slept. Gloria was in the ICU at Mount Sinai, connected to a dialysis machine, her face swollen beyond recognition, her breathing shallow and mechanical. The doctors spoke in careful, measured tones about renal function percentages and fluid retention levels, but what they meant underneath the numbers was simple. It was bad. It could go either way. Aisha stood outside the glass partition of the ICU, holding a cup of hospital coffee she had not touched, watching her mother's chest rise and fall with the rhythm of the machine, and she thought about the $47,000 already owed, and the $120,000 now being added on top, and the number was so large it stopped feeling like money and started feeling like a wall built specifically to crush her. That same Tuesday evening, Derek called again. This time his voice did not just shake, it broke. "Marcus got arrested. You need to come home now." Jalen's crew had attempted to rob an electronics warehouse in East New York. Marcus had not been inside the warehouse. He had not touched the merchandise. But he had been the one who hacked the electronic lock system from a laptop in a parked car 2 blocks away. And the police found him still sitting there when they arrived, the screen still glowing with the access codes. He was 14 years old. He was charged as a juvenile accessory. He was taken to the Brooklyn Juvenile Detention Center on Atlantic Avenue, a gray cinder-block building with barred windows that looked exactly like what it was. Wednesday morning, Aisha called Kai's office. She did not explain. She said only, "I need personal leave, family emergency." Her voice was flat and controlled in the way that voices become when the person behind them has used up everything they have. Kai said, "Take whatever time you need." He did not ask questions. But after she hung up, he sat at his desk for a long time without moving, his hand still resting on the phone. Aisha spent Wednesday running between Mount Sinai on the Upper East Side and the juvenile facility in downtown Brooklyn, a distance of 11 miles that felt like 1,100. At the detention center, she sat on a metal chair in a visiting room with pale green walls and fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency designed to make everyone inside feel worse than they already did. Marcus appeared on the other side of the glass partition. He was wearing a grey jumpsuit 2 sizes too large. His eyes were red. He was trying to look hard, the way boys his age tried to look when they were terrified, but his hand trembled when he placed it against the glass. "Sis, I am sorry. I just wanted to help Mama." Aisha bit down on her lower lip until she tasted blood. She could not speak. She placed her palm flat against the glass, directly opposite his, and held it there. The glass was cold. His hand on the other side was shaking. Neither of them said another word for a long time. On Thursday, the second blow landed. Robert Langford, operating through an intermediary he had used before for sensitive matters, delivered a file to the newsroom of the New York Post. The file contained Aisha's background, her mother's medical debts, her brother's arrest record from the previous day, photographs of Aisha entering and exiting One Manhattan West, and a suggested headline that read like a grenade with the pin already pulled. "Slum Intern and Billionaire CEO, a love story or a ladder?" The article went live at 6 a.m. By 8, it was trending. By noon, Kai's publicist had fielded 47 press inquiries. Kai saw the article on his phone while standing in the elevator. He read it once, put the phone in his pocket, and walked directly to his office. He called Aisha. No answer. He called again. Nothing. He called Richard Calloway, his personal attorney, a man in his 50s with a voice like gravel and a reputation for making legal problems disappear before they reached a courtroom. Kill the article, defamation suit if necessary, and find out who sent the file. Then he did something he had never done in his life. He left the building in the middle of the workday, walked to the parking garage, and drove his black Maybach south toward Brooklyn. The car looked like a hallucination parked on Pitkin Avenue. The building's brick facade was crumbling in places, the fire escape rusted to the color of dried blood, and the hallway on the 4th floor smelled of mildew and cooking grease that had soaked into the walls over decades. Kai climbed the stairs because the elevator had an out-of-order sign taped to it with masking tape that had yellowed with age. He stood in front of apartment 4C and knocked. Aisha opened the door. Her eyes were swollen nearly shut. Her hair, usually pulled back with immaculate precision, hung loose and tangled around her face. She was still wearing the wrinkled Goodwill blazer from the day before. In her hand was a stack of medical bills held together with a rubber band. She looked at Kai, standing in his Tom Ford suit in the dim, mouldy hallway, and took one step back as if the contrast itself was a kind of violence. "What are you doing here?" "I know about your mother. I know about Marcus. I want to help." Aisha shook her head. Her voice cracked down the middle like a plate dropped on a stone floor. "No, I am not taking your money. I am not a charity project. I am not a story you tell yourself so you can feel like a good person, and I will not become a burden to anyone. Not to you, not to anyone." Kai did not step inside. He did not try to persuade her. He stood at the threshold, his hands at his sides, and when he spoke his voice carried a tremor that had not been there in more than 10 years, a sound so unfamiliar that even he seemed startled by it. "My mother died when I was 12. She was sick too. I stood outside the emergency room, and they would not let me in. My father was at a dinner party. I sat alone in that hospital corridor for 6 hours. When they finally let me through the door, she was already cold." He swallowed. His eyes dropped to the dirty hallway floor. "I am not here because of pity. I am here because I know what it feels like to stand alone in front of a hospital at 2 a.m. And I do not want you to go through that." Aisha stood motionless, her hand gripping the doorframe so tightly the tendons stood out like cords. Tears ran down her face, but she did not wipe them. It was the first time she had cried in front of anyone outside her family. She did not say yes, she did not say thank you. She simply stepped to the side and let him walk into the small apartment where Gloria lay on the bed in the back room, and Derek Washington sat in a chair beside her, holding a glass of water near the older woman's lips. Derek looked up when Kai entered. The expression that crossed his face was one that only a man who has loved someone in silence for years would recognize, a mixture of understanding and loss arriving in the same instant. He watched Kai sit down carefully beside Gloria's bed, watched the older woman open her eyes and begin telling him about Aisha as a little girl, watched Kai's hands steady the water glass with a gentleness that did not belong to the man the newspapers described. Derek set his own hands on his knees, stood quietly, and walked out to the narrow balcony overlooking Pitkin Avenue. He leaned against the rusted railing and looked down at the street where he had grown up, where he had learned to ride a bike, where he had first understood that he loved Aisha Malone. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to feel the sadness of something that was never going to be his. But he also knew, standing there in the cold with the sound of traffic below and the faint murmur of voices behind him, that loving her had always meant wanting her to be happy, even if that happiness did not include him. That same evening, Jonas Webb sat alone in his office on the 44th floor of 1 Manhattan West. The building was nearly empty. The cleaning crew had already passed through. On his desk sat a framed photograph of his 2 children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 9, both smiling in matching red sweaters from last Christmas. His phone buzzed. Robert Langford's name appeared on the screen. He answered. Langford's voice was unhurried but precise. "The board meeting is next week, Jonas. You vote with me or I release everything. Your choice." The line went dead. Jonas set the phone down. He stared at the photograph of his children for a very long time. Then he opened his email, typed a message to Kai Voss, and wrote 6 words. "I need to see you. I owe you a truth." He pressed send before he could change his mind, and then sat back in his chair with his eyes closed, feeling something he had not felt in 3 years, the terrifying and unmistakable relief of a man who has finally decided to stop lying. Later that night, from the apartment in Brownsville, Kai made 3 phone calls. The first was to Nathan Cross, a criminal defense attorney widely regarded as the best juvenile advocate in New York, a man in his early 40s with a shaved head and a quiet intensity that judges respected, to represent Marcus, not to erase the charges, but to ensure a 14-year-old boy received a fair hearing and a chance at rehabilitation rather than incarceration. The second call was to the billing department at Mount Sinai, where he arranged to have Gloria's entire medical expense covered through a health charity foundation, structured so that Aisha would not be able to trace the money back to him. The third call was to his grandmother. "Grandma, I need your advice. I'm afraid I will destroy her the way I have destroyed every relationship I have ever had." The line was quiet for several seconds. Then Maggie's voice came through, steady as a foundation stone. "Destroying is what happens when you run away. Staying, that is what takes courage." The boardroom on the 50th floor of 1 Manhattan West had been designed to intimidate. The ceiling rose 14 feet high. The conference table, a single slab of black walnut polished to a mirror finish, stretched 22 feet from end to end. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped 3 walls, offering a panoramic view of Manhattan that on a clear day reached from the Statue of Liberty to the George Washington Bridge. On this particular Monday morning in mid-December, the sky was the color of iron, and a thin rain streaked the glass, making the city below look as though it were dissolving. 9 members of the Voss Capital Board of Directors sat around the table. Robert Langford had arrived early, positioned himself at the far end opposite the chairman's seat, and spent the preceding 40 minutes in quiet conversation with the 3 members he believed he had secured. His face carried the composed confidence of a man who had counted his votes and found the number sufficient. The formal agenda item read, "Review of executive leadership decisions and their impact on company reputation," language so carefully neutral it could have meant anything, which was precisely the point. Everyone in the room understood the real purpose. Remove the intern. Restrain the CEO. Restore the order that Robert Langford considered natural. Kai Voss entered the room at 9 o'clock exactly. He wore a dark navy suit, no tie, his shirt collar open by one button. He carried nothing except a small black USB drive, which he placed on the table beside his water glass with the quiet precision of a man setting down a chess piece. He did not bring Richard Calloway. He did not bring notes. He sat down, folded his hands on the table, and waited. Robert opened the proceedings with practiced gravity. "Mr. Voss, the board has expressed concern that certain recent decisions, particularly regarding personnel, have been influenced by personal relationships that may not serve the company's best interests. We ask that you address these concerns." Kai nodded slowly. "I will address them. But first, allow me to share some information that I believe the board will find relevant." He picked up the USB drive, inserted it into the port built into the table's surface, and the wall-mounted screen behind him came to life. The first image was an email chain. The headers showed correspondence between Robert Langford and the CEO of a competing investment firm, Meridian Partners. The content made the room go still. Robert had shared Voss Capital's internal strategy documents for the Southeast Asian expansion, including proprietary risk models and client lists, in exchange for a guaranteed equity stake in Meridian's new infrastructure fund. The dates on the emails spanned 8 months. The second set of documents showed wire transfers to an offshore account linked to a shell company registered under the name of Robert's wife. The third item was a recording, audio only, of Robert Langford's voice on the phone with Jonas Webb, captured the previous week. The words were unmistakable. "You vote with me, or I release everything. Your choice." The room was silent in the way that rooms become silent when the air itself seems to have stopped moving. Robert Langford's face had gone from composed to colourless in the space of 90 seconds, his right hand resting on the table, curled slowly into a fist. Jonas Webb stood up. He was visibly shaking. His reading glasses had slid down his nose, and he did not push them back. His voice trembled, but each word was distinct and deliberate. "I confirm what you have just heard. Mr. Langford threatened me with personal information to force my vote against the CEO. He has been leveraging a private transaction I made 3 years ago, one I should have disclosed and did not. I owe this company and Mr. Voss an apology for taking so long to say this." He paused, swallowed, and then added, "I also wish to disclose the transaction in full to the board and accept whatever consequences follow. I am done being afraid." Jonas sat down. The silence held for another 5 seconds before the murmuring began, low and urgent, moving around the table like wind through grass. Kai spoke again. His voice had not risen by a single degree. "I did not come here to defend a personal relationship. I came here to protect this company from people who are destroying it from the inside. Aisha Malone identified an $80 million hidden liability in Project Prometheus in her first week, a liability that our entire senior analyst team missed. She is in this company because of her ability, not because of any other reason." He stood, placed both hands flat on the table, and looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. If this board wants to hold a vote of no confidence because I evaluate people by their capability rather than their pedigree, go ahead. But before you vote, remember who pulled this company back from bankruptcy 3 years ago. Remember who sat in this chair when no one else would. The chairman, a man named Walter Stein, 72 years old with a white beard trimmed close in the deliberate manner of someone who had chaired more boardrooms than most people had entered, called for the vote. The count was taken by hand, 7-2 in favor of Kai Voss. Robert Langford and one ally voted against. The chairman then read a prepared motion requesting Robert Langford's immediate resignation from the board, citing breach of fiduciary duty and conduct detrimental to the company. Robert stood without speaking, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of the room. His footsteps on the marble corridor outside were the only sound for several seconds. Victoria Langford had been waiting in the reception area on the 49th floor, 1 story below, sitting in a leather chair with her legs crossed and her phone in her hand. She had dressed carefully that morning, a cream blazer, gold earrings, her hair swept up, as if she were preparing to re-enter a building she had been forced to leave. When her phone buzzed with her father's message, 2 words, "It's over," the colour left her face in a slow wave, starting at her forehead and moving downward until even her lips were pale. She gripped the phone until the case creaked. Then she stood, smoothed her blazer with both hands in a gesture that looked more like holding herself together than adjusting fabric, and walked to the elevator without looking at anyone. 11 miles south and 60 stories below, Aisha Malone sat in a chair beside her mother's bed in the ICU at Mount Sinai. Gloria had passed the crisis point 2 days earlier. Her breathing had steadied. The dialysis machine hummed its low, mechanical rhythm. Colour was returning to her face, slowly, the way warmth returns to a house after the furnace has been relit. A nurse named Pamela, a stout woman with kind eyes and 20 years of nephrology experience, had told Aisha that morning, "Your mama is a fighter. She is not going anywhere yet." Aisha held her mother's hand. Gloria's fingers were thin and dry, but they squeezed back with surprising strength. "Baby girl." Gloria's voice was a thread, but her eyes were bright and clear. "I know someone is helping us. I don't know who, but I know you are not alone anymore." She turned her head on the pillow to look directly at her daughter. "Don't be afraid to let someone love you, child. Being strong does not mean being alone." Aisha lowered her head until her forehead rested against the back of her mother's hand. She closed her eyes. The fluorescent light hummed above them. The machine beeped its steady count. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Aisha Malone allowed herself to not be the strongest person in the room. That same afternoon, in a juvenile courtroom on Schermerhorn Street in downtown Brooklyn, Marcus Malone stood before Judge Catherine Hale, a woman in her late 50s with short silver hair and a reputation for being simultaneously firm and fair with young offenders. Nathan Cross, the attorney Kai had retained, had spent the previous week building a case for diversion rather than detention. He presented Marcus's academic record, his coding aptitude scores, letters from 2 teachers, and a detailed rehabilitation plan that included enrollment in a 12-month STEM education program and 200 hours of community service. Marcus stood at the podium in a white shirt Aisha had ironed for him that morning. His hands gripped the wooden edge. His voice shook, but he did not stop. "Your Honor, I did something wrong. I knew it was wrong when I did it, and I did it anyway. I am asking for a second chance. Not because I deserve one, but because my sister gave up everything so I could stand here today, and I do not want her sacrifice to be for nothing." The courtroom was quiet. Judge Hale looked at Marcus over the rims of her glasses for a long moment. Then she looked at Nathan Cross, at the file in front of her, and back at the boy. She spoke in a measured voice. "Mr. Malone, the court grants diversion into the community rehabilitation program under the conditions outlined by your counsel. You will complete the STEM program, you will complete the community service hours, and you will not appear before me again. Do I make myself clear?" Marcus nodded, his eyes filling. "Yes, Your Honor." The gavel came down with a single, sharp sound. Aisha sat in the back row of the courtroom, her hands clasped in her lap. Tears were running down her face, but this time, for the first time in a week that had broken her apart piece by piece, she was smiling. 1 year later, the sky over Manhattan was the kind of October blue that made the whole city look like it had been washed clean overnight. The trees along Columbus Avenue had turned gold and copper, their leaves catching the afternoon light and holding it the way cupped hands hold water, briefly and beautifully. The air carried the first real coolness of autumn, sharp enough to notice but not yet cold enough to hurt, the kind of weather that made people walk a little slower and look up a little more. Inside the David Geffen Hall at Lincoln Center, 500 chairs had been arranged in a gentle curve facing a low stage backed by a screen that read, in clean white letters, "The Voss Malone Foundation, Opening Doors." The guests were filing in, a mix of business executives in dark suits, educators in blazers that looked slightly less expensive, journalists with press badges clipped to their lapels, and scattered among them in clusters of 2 and 3. Young men and women in their early 20s who looked around the room with the particular alertness of people who had not yet learned to take places like this for granted. Kai Voss stood at the edge of the stage, adjusting the cuff of his dark blue suit jacket. He was not wearing the Rolex. On his left wrist instead was a woman's watch, small and old, its leather straps softened and cracked with age. It had belonged to his mother. He had kept it in the bottom drawer of his desk for 22 years, and had put it on this morning without hesitation, as if he had been waiting for the right day, and today was simply. Beside him stood Aisha. She wore a cream-white dress that fell just below her knees, her hair braided close to her head, in a pattern her mother had done for her that morning, and in her ears were small gold studs that Gloria had given her the day she received her master's degree from Columbia, completed in the evenings over the past year while working full-time. She was no longer an intern. Her title was Director of Talent Development for the Voss Malone Foundation, a fund dedicated to supporting internships and career pathways for young people from underserved communities. She and Kai had built it together. Kai stepped to the microphone. The hall quieted. "A year ago, someone asked me why I risked my career for an intern." He paused, not for effect, but because the memory still carried weight. The answer is simple. She was never a risk. She was the smartest investment I have ever made, not for the company, for my life. He turned to Aisha. His voice dropped, but the microphone caught every word. "You were the first person who looked me in the eye and was not afraid, and because of that, I finally had the courage to look at myself." Aisha stepped forward. Her voice filled the hall, warm and steady, carrying the particular resonance of someone who had learned to speak not from training, but from necessity. "I grew up in Brownsville, Brooklyn, a place where if you are a black girl poor and you dare to dream big, people will tell you that you are crazy. But my mother taught me something. She said, 'My statik, stand up straight. You do not need anyone's permission.' Today this foundation exists so that every girl, every boy from a neighborhood like mine has a door to walk through, not because of pity, because they deserve it. The hall rose to its feet. The applause was not polite. It was real. In the front row, Gloria Malone sat with her back straight and her chin high, healthier than she had been in years, her silver hair wrapped in a bright yellow headscarf that she had chosen specifically because it was the color of sunlight. Her face was fuller now. The swelling from the steroids finally receded after months of a new treatment protocol that Mount Sinai's nephrology team had adjusted for her. She was smiling in the way that mothers smile when they have lived long enough to see the thing they prayed for. Her hand rested on top of Marcus's. He was 15 now, taller than he had been a year ago, wearing a white button-down shirt tucked into dark trousers. Pinned to his chest was a small badge from the STEM education program he had completed 3 months ahead of schedule. Beside him on the seat rested a laptop, new, not second-hand, purchased with money he had earned himself from a coding internship at Voss Capital's technology division, a position Nathan Cross had helped arrange as part of his rehabilitation plan, and one Marcus had kept through merit alone. In the second row, Margaret Voss sat with her hands folded in her lap, her pale grey eyes narrowed slightly as she watched her grandson on the stage. The expression on her face was not surprise, it was confirmation. She leaned toward Helga, her housekeeper, who sat beside her in a rare public outing, and said quietly, "His mother is up there smiling right now. I am certain of it." Near the end of the same row, Derek Washington stood rather than sat, clapping with the slow, steady rhythm of a man who meant every beat. He was smiling. The smile held joy and a trace of something that had once been sadness, but had since settled into peace, the way a river settles after a storm, still moving but no longer turbulent. He had begun seeing a doctor at the hospital, a woman named Lydia Chen, 30, with a quiet laugh and steady hands. She smiled the way Aisha smiled, but her eyes looked at Derek the way Aisha's never had, with the particular attention of someone who had chosen him specifically. In a corner seat near the back, Jonas Webb sat alone. He had resigned as CFO 6 months earlier, the day after the board voted to accept his full disclosure. Kai had refused to let him disappear entirely. The truth arrived late, Kai had said, but late is still better than never. Jonas now held the title of senior advisor, a quieter role with less authority, but one that allowed him to rebuild trust in small daily increments, the way a cracked wall is repaired not by tearing it down, but by filling each fracture with something stronger than what was there before. He clapped along with the room, his face carrying the careful gratitude of a man who understood exactly how close he had come to losing everything. After the ceremony, the crowd spilled into the reception hall and then out onto the terrace overlooking the Lincoln Center Plaza. Aisha and Kai found themselves alone on the balcony as the last of the guests moved inside for drinks. The October wind carried the smell of fallen leaves and the distant sound of a street musician playing saxophone somewhere below. Kai reached for Aisha's hand. It was the first time he had held it where anyone could see. "You know," he said, looking out at the plaza, "I spent my whole life building walls so no one could get in. You did not break them down. You just stood there, patient, until I opened the door myself." Aisha laughed, a full, open laugh, the kind that belonged to Brownsville stoops and summer nights. "I was not patient. I'm just stubborn." Kai laughed. It was rare, that sound, but warm, and it hung in the cold air like breath made visible. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small box wrapped in black velvet. He opened it. Inside was not a diamond ring. It was a key. The key to the new office of the Voss Malone Foundation, located on the ground floor of 1 Manhattan West, in the exact space where Aisha had first walked through the revolving doors 14 months ago with her worn-down heels and her lunchbox of rice and black beans. "This building is where you started," Kai said. "Now it is where you build." Aisha took the key. Her fingers traced the cold metal ridges. She did not say, "Thank you." She said, "We build." Kai nodded. "We build." That evening, the Malone family sat around the dinner table in their new apartment in Harlem, a bright two-bedroom with tall windows that looked out onto Marcus Garvey Park, where the last autumn leaves were still clinging to the oaks. Gloria had cooked her traditional Creole chicken, the recipe her own mother had brought north from Alabama 40 years ago. Marcus set the table, counting forks and knives with the same precision he applied to lines of code. Aisha poured water into glasses. Kai sat at the end of the table opposite Gloria, his hands fumbling awkwardly with the napkin fold, until Marcus leaned over and fixed it for him with a grin. Gloria looked at her two children and the man who was trying, visibly and earnestly, to fit into the rhythm of an ordinary family dinner. She said, "Aisha, I grew up in Alabama. Your grandfather used to say, 'Rich or poor does not matter. What matters is whether everyone is laughing when they sit down at the table.' Today I see everyone laughing." Aisha reached for her mother's hand. Her other hand found Marcus's beneath the table. He squeezed back gently, but enough for her to know that her brother had come home. Across town, in a half-empty apartment on the Upper West Side, Victoria Langford sat by the window in a chair she had not moved from for an hour. The apartment was quieter than it had ever been. Her phone, once a constant source of invitations and messages, had not rung in days. Her father Robert was under internal investigation and had retreated to the family estate in Connecticut, unreachable even to her. The network of connections that had defined her life, the dinners, the charity galas, the whispered alliances in powder rooms, had dissolved so completely it was as if they had never existed. On the table beside the window lay an envelope. Inside was a letter inviting her to join a mentoring program for young women entrepreneurs, sponsored by the Voss Malone Foundation. There was no sender's name on the card, but Victoria knew who had sent it. She stared at the letter for a long time. For the first time in memory, the expression that settled on her face was not anger, not calculation, not the sharp, defensive pride she had worn like armor since childhood. It was shame. She had not yet replied, but she had not thrown the letter away. The story closes on a quiet street in Lower Manhattan as the sun sets behind the Hudson River. Aisha stands in front of the glass doors on the ground floor of 1 Manhattan West, the same doors she walked through on her first day with $11 blazer and a glued heel. The key is in her hand. Behind the glass, she can see the empty office that will become the headquarters of the Voss Malone Foundation, the place where hundreds of young people from neighborhoods like hers will find the door that was never open for them before. Kai stands a few steps behind her. He does not hold her hand. He does not put his arm around her. He simply stands there, steady, the way he has learned that love is not about possession, but about presence. Outside, autumn has laid its gold across the sidewalks. The late afternoon light filters through the trees and scatters in dancing patches across the glass. Aisha slides the key into the lock and turns it. The door opens, and this time she walks in not because anyone gave her permission, but because she earned it. Friends, before we close this story, I want to sit with you for a moment. Aisha walked into that glass tower with a glued heel and a lunchbox of rice and beans. She did not have a family name that opened doors. She did not have a trust fund or a safety net. What she had was a straight back and a mind that refused to kneel. and that was enough. But here is the lesson I want you to carry with you tonight. This story is not about a billionaire saving a poor girl. Kai did not save Aisha. She was already standing before he ever noticed her. What he did was choose to stand beside her. And what she did was choose to let him in. That is the real courage in this story, not the boardroom battle, not the courtroom scene. The courage was a girl who had every reason to shut the world out, deciding to trust one more time, and a man who had forgotten how to feel, deciding that feeling was worth the risk. You do not need a tower in Manhattan to live this story. Maybe you are the Aisha in your own life, carrying more weight than anyone knows, showing up every day with a smile that hides how tired you really are. Maybe you are the Kai, frozen behind walls you built so long ago you forgot there was a door. Maybe you are the Derek, loving someone quietly and learning to let go with grace. Or maybe you are the Marcus, one bad decision deep, wondering if it is too late to turn around. It is not too late. It is never too late. The door is always there. You just have to be brave enough to turn the key. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment and tell me which moment stayed with you the longest. Subscribe to this channel so you do not miss the next journey we take together. And if you believe that God watches over those who refuse to give up, type Amen in the comments. I believe He does. I believe He is watching over you right now, wherever you are, whatever you are carrying. May God bless you and your family. May He give strength to every Aisha and every Marcus out there, fighting to stand straight. We will meet again in the next story. Thank you for listening with your whole heart.